Welcome to An Archbender's Journal, The Last Will of Lucy Sutton. I'm your host, Terrence Franklin. In each episode, we go on an odyssey to discover my family history, and I invite guests to share their stories to bend the arc of history with their own legacy. You can find the show through YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and more. Now please, join me for An Archbender's Journal, The Last Will of Lucy Sutton. I'm your host, Terry Franklin. Hey everybody, welcome to the show, to the Archbender's Journal. I'm so happy to be here on this Friday before Mother's Day. Happy Mother's Day to all the mothers out there. I got my mom sitting over my shoulder. She's also sitting at home in Olympia Fields, Illinois. So love to you. It won't be out by then, but they'll know. Anyway, I'm so happy to have my guest here, Dr. Nola Haynes. As you can see, she's listed as an academic, foreign policy, and national security expert. And I'm going to pull out this piece of paper right here as I get started with you, Nola. Dr. Nola Haynes, I know you are an adjunct professor at Georgetown, an adjunct senior fellow for the Technology and National Security Program at the Center for National Security, where you advise the State Department, and you're also affiliated with the National Security Policy Center at the University of Virginia. Now, what do you do?
Leave it up to you, T, to get to the bottom line. Like, okay, what does all that mean? Well, one thing that it sounds like a lot of affiliations and titles, and it is. But the one thing that I love about this kind of life is that I have a lot of flexibility. So when you're affiliated with a place, like say my affiliation with the University of Virginia, that doesn't mean that I'm splitting my time between Georgetown and Virginia. It means if I have a paper that I published, that I can go give a talk there, that I have a community there within the national security, among the national security scholars. So that's what that means. But I teach at Georgetown. So that's kind of like my academic home base for right now. And so I am an academic who is also a practitioner within the foreign policy and national security space.
Okay, a practitioner within the foreign policy and national security space. That sounds like you know a lot about what's going on, what's going on in the world, how safe we are, how safe we might not be. Why don't you tell me? I guess I'm also curious. How did you get into that in the first place? I know I didn't prep you for that, but how did you get into that?
First of all, I think, people out there need to know that T and I know each other, and he has been with me on this journey, honey, when I was trying to decide between law school and Ph.D. So he has been there, and he's like, girl, how?
And you have rocket, So how did you get here?
Okay. So that's a fair question. So, when Harvard plays a really big role into this when I was there. I was there during a very, very interesting time. My allergies are acting up. I was there during a very interesting time during the Boston bombings, during Occupy. There was a lot that was going on. I was in a program where I had to learn a language, and the language I chose was Arabic. And it was, and I did a, stop it.
Already that's I love my French, but it's a Romance language, so I'm used to that. When you get into the Arabic and completely different, that's okay.
So I was on the yard learning Arabic.
So, audience, this tells you something about this woman, about her capacity to do things that are extraordinary and to just step out there and do it. So, I mean, that's one of the things that inspires me about it. But anyway, tell me, how did you choose this area?
It kind of chose me. Recently I was in DC, I think last month, and I heard Ambassador Bonnie Jenkins talk about how you just find it, the space kind of finds you. There's an interesting thing that happens, and you'll be like, I might be interested in this talk, or I might be interested in this topic. And next thing you know, you look up and you're like in it. So while I was at Harvard, and as you know, Harvard is a very interesting learning space. It's a plurality of things. And at the Divinity School, we were dealing still in the kind of terrorism,
Mhm.
moment. It was the early 2000s, so that was still a thing. So even though I was at the divinity school, there was this mixture of politics, ethics,
Right.
religion, theology, all of these admixtures, right? So I was in a program where, yes, it was about religion and ethics and philosophy, but it also had this heavy, heavy kind of identity piece, terrorism piece, and how identity is wrapped up in that, coupled with the Boston bombings. And I just got drawn to it. And when I was trying to figure out law school or PhD life, I started looking around at political science programs because I was a political science major in undergrad at UCLA. And I knew that I wanted to do something international. I didn't know what yet. And so USC had a PhD program with a strong focus in international affairs in political science.
Okay.
So I was drawn to USC for that program. And inside of that program is when the Donald Trump came into power. And the first national security policy was the travel ban. And because of my background with religion, identity, and terrorism, I was drawn to the travel ban as a research topic, and then got drawn into it even more, deeper into terrorism, deeper into sanctions, deeper into arms control. So that's how all of this, began to unfold. It just kind of all aligned. And here I am, steeped in arms control and international security. Um,
Well, I'm a big believer in finding your mission, and my mission came to me later in life that I came to understand that. But it's appreciating that flow. I think you are a great example of that. You've got these amazing degrees from fantastic institutions, but you followed the flow of your curiosity. I think that's part of it, and pursued the things that would open doors in new ways that nobody's thought about before. So I think there's also an aspect of innovation and uh, like creativity that is part of your life path. That's just amazing to me. So you study these security threats, national security threats, Trumpism, and what it might involve, all those kinds of things.
Yeah, not Trumpism per se, more the impact of when you have someone in a decision making position who leads with bias in terms of policy and the
Right.
impact that that has on national security policy making. So I don't necessarily, I can't say that I'm a Trumpism type of scholar. There are tons of folks out there doing that kind of work, but I will say it is it's given me a blueprint in terms of my overall interest, in really looking at the intersection between identity bias, policy, foreign policy, and why it's important for a decision maker not to incorporate their own biases in any sort of policy regarding security. It shouldn't be in any policy period, but
Mhm.
especially when we're talking about security, that should be decisions made emotionless. And what I mean by that, yes, to care about the human security aspect, but not to bring your own thoughts and feelings and emotions to the table and then policy make, from your feelings and emotions is what I mean. So that's one part of what I do. In the policy practitioner space, I do I have the extreme privilege. A lot of academics actually do not have the privilege of being able to
Mhm.
also work in the policy space. My education in the policy world is quite different from my education as an academic, and I just feel so fortunate to be able to have both simultaneous educations and experiences. It's nothing like it. So I feel uniquely fortunate to be able to have both.
Well, that goes to the nature of recognizing that your identities and any of our identities are complex and layered, and you come from a fascinating background. I know you were a child star on TV, and so you've
I don't
had,
know about star.
well, you were on TV.
I was. I was union.
So, so that's an aspect of identity that you then shape and you transform, and you continue to grow and add layers and use what you had before to develop what comes next. And I know a part of you is very aware of appearances and how we can make an impact in ways that aren't just the words that we say. You always look fabulous, and I noticed your trademark lipstick. I think that's something that's been a choice for you, right? Can you tell me a
Yeah.
little bit about how you use your look and your appearance and your awareness of it to help advance your mission?
I had I can't remember who it was. A few years ago, a friend said to me, it would be easy to mistake, my kind of style etiquette from being in LA for so long. And they're like, no, that comes from, you being born and raised in New Orleans. I was like, yes, thank you. You get it. So it starts with, you know, my grandmother, my mother, parents, family, instilling in you when you step outside, you represent the whole family. Right. So that also extends itself to you representing a whole community. Right. So I take that quite seriously. And the women in my family, honey, they dress and show up and show out. You understand me? My mom is in a nursing home, and you best believe we're gonna go get those nails and toes done on Mother's Day in her wheelchair.
Okay.
You best believe. So, and then another part of it is for me, being in a space that I'm in, there is this idea that in order for a woman to be taken seriously, you have to
Mhm.
dial down your femininity. I don't necessarily agree with that. I'm not saying, show up like you're about to go to the club. No.
Right.
There's a way to present yourself,
Mhm.
if you are a woman who chooses to, lean in the more feminine, feminine aspects of your identity. Not every woman chooses to do that, and that's absolutely fine. I am not one of those women.
Right.
I am going to show up with my lipstick. I am going to show up with my clothes. You should see what I'm wearing to this conference in June, T. Oh, honey.
Okay.
Um, but that's part of my Southern armor. I heard Janelle Monáe talk about this in a different way, and she's definitely expressing herself in different ways these days.
You gonna wear
Okay.
some outfits like that to the conference?
No. Uh-uh. Uh-uh.
Something unwrapped for the Met Gala and layers
Uh-uh.
and layers and
Well, yeah, her Met Gala looks are yes, yes, yes.
right.
But my point being, I love dressing up. I love um, stepping fully into my femininity. And it really comes from this idea, that this definitely comes from the women in my family. It doesn't matter how you're feeling, you need to show up for yourself.
Right.
And once upon a time, even when I didn't want to, I'd put the lipstick on as kind of like my yeah, like I said, as my armor. Even if I wasn't feeling that great that day, I feel like I've been in grad school for 18,000 billion years, and you don't feel very good every single day, but I put on that red lipstick and it does something for me, right? It
Right.
empowers me. It reminds me of who I am. And it's become something more than that.
Right.
It's become something that women have told me that they appreciate that I do, a lot of professional women. Mac has even tweeted at me a time or two, so it's something that I'm like, there's something to this. There's
Yeah.
something to empowering women who choose to look more feminine at work to do so, right? um and feminine doesn't necessarily equate to, like, sexy kitty type
Right.
of like stereotypes. I'm not talking about that, but just to feel comfortable at the very least to wear red lipstick.
Yeah. I think part of it is that you do it authentically. This is how you live your life, what you bring forth. And I heard somebody say the other day that if they aren't bringing forth their full self, if they aren't presenting to the world who they are, then they're not fully shining their light. And you don't know who needs to see that light, who needs to
Absolutely.
to see your example and to go, yeah, I don't have to try to pretend to be something that I'm not in order to be understood, appreciated, respected. I watch you on on TV, on CNN or MSNBC, and you are as smart and as aware and as competent and abundantly overcompetent in being able to explain and to make understandable complex ideas about international global issues. And yet what you present is a woman who's confident, who knows herself, and who is here not to be tested, because here you are. I'm I'm Dr. Nola Haynes, and I'm showing up as me. So I love that. And it's really amazing to see you do that. And I also want to talk to you a little bit more substantively about what's going on in the world today. I heard the word polycrisis not too long ago. I don't know if that's something that you use, but to me, I understood it to be this idea that there's all these things going on, national levels and international, that are all happening at the same time, and it creates a great deal of stress and concern, I think. And I wonder about your sense of it as a national security expert. What do you see that's going on globally and nationally that might impact our security and our safety here in this country?
Well, this is one of the beauties about being able to be in the policy space. As an academic, we pick a thing and we nitpick that thing till we have like one toe on the ground, you know. But in the policy world, in the policy world, the portfolio is quite vast. So you get exposed to a lot of different problems. And I haven't heard polycrisis, but there are tons of, there are tons of terms out there describing the integrated, migrated, crises that are happening across the board, across the world, across the globe. And I think it's a good way to kind of sum up the different things that we're feeling and that we're seeing. And one thing I want to say is, before I get to what I think is the largest threat, the one thing that I want to say is polycrises, if we're using that term, has always existed. Which changed this technology and our interconnectedness and the way that we receive information, which is quite instant, right? So conflicts, wars, civil wars have always happened, right? Droughts, famines always happened. What is a little bit different is when we're thinking about Ukraine and Russia, which, it's a different situation in that when Russia invaded Ukraine in 2014, which it very much was, they tried to do it a little bit more clandestine. This time, honey, they were just out there. They were just we here, like it was like, okay, so you just brazenly invaded a country, and so that is the largest difference. And for people like me in the beginning of it, what was important was to not repeat the mistakes of the late 30s in Europe, not to let Russia go beyond Ukraine, because then we could easily be in another world war. And that's, no one wanted that, right? No one wanted war. So to be this close to the precipice of World War III, I would say the last time that we were even as close was the Cuban Missile Crisis. But for it to be all in out war, in Eastern Europe, that has definitely changed things. Who would have thought that Finland would be in NATO? Sweden. Who would have thought that, Germany would have reversed on some of its war and arms policies? Who would have, all of the different things that are occurring that people just wouldn't have thought 2 years ago. 2 years ago, we wouldn't have thought these things. Countries pulling out of using US dollars, countries leaving, abandoning Russian oil, all of these different kind of transitions. And years ago, as an academic, and this is the one thing that I do love about having an academic lens, is that a lot of us realize that things were changing years ago. We saw the different changes, right? I don't think any of us could have predicted Russia invading Ukraine,
No.
but we saw things were changing, right? The shifts were changing. So the world has been through this before, and we'll get through it again. But because of technology, the way that we get information so quickly, it just seems like a constant barrage of ugliness and problems, right? I mean, if we think about what's happening in Sudan, when we think about the 58 people that were taken in Nigeria, there are
Right.
just so many things that are going on, around the world.
And we hear about them because we have, as you say, the technology gives all of us access to this information on a minute by minute basis in ways that you could only read so many newspapers to have an understanding about what was going on as a layperson. And I imagine that the fact that information can get through governmental barriers, so that there are people in Russia who have access to outside information that in a prior war, in prior years, they wouldn't have had. And there's still that question of whether they have the ability to fight against a Russian government. But I have to imagine that the way that information can seep and creep, and with AI being able to create all kinds of fake information and misinformation and disinformation, and politicians can say things they never said, that it feels more troubling to me. And maybe that's because I haven't lived through all the prior incidents of, of global threat. But I agree with you that there have always been threats to all of us. And so, what do you think are the biggest threats that we are facing right at this moment? If you could sort of characterize what you think you're most concerned about.
I don't consider myself an alarmist, and I don't consider myself someone who kind of latches on to the talking points for the sake of latching on to the talking points. But the threat to democracy is real. It is very real. And what we're seeing in our country right now, and this is the national security part that has implications for foreign policy. So I think Americans, first of all, we don't tend to think about national security and foreign policy, not really. And then if we're thinking about national security, we're not thinking about foreign policy, but this is the intersection, right? This is the intersection. So the threat to democracy and the rise of, the autocrat, oh my
The
goodness.
authoritarian impulse with diminishment of our institutions.
Yes, authoritarianism. There we go. I'm sorry, I couldn't get it out. In the in the West, what is happening on the fringes, these populist movements are really delving into fascist territory, and I mean that academically. And what that means is, I'm not just using that as a throwaway term, is you suppress certain things. So the way that books are being banned, the way that education is being manipulated and controlled, that's one of the mechanisms in which fascism gets deployed and used inside of society. So that's one part. The way that you nationalize religion. So you nationalize religion to kind of center itself around a particular brand of Christianity that doesn't exactly, if it invites diversity, it invites diversity in once diversity pledges its allegiance to its specific type of Christianity, right? And then you have the violence component. So you have the control of education, you have the nationalization of religion, and then you have this violence component. Now, the thing with fascism is the violence is typically what leads the movement. And that's the scariest part of it. And we saw those early, we saw that with 1/6. So for people to say, fascism is a strong word, we're not there yet, open your eyes.
Right.
I was looking at some of my old tweets, see, from November before 1/6 happened, and I was predicting it.
Right.
People need to open their eyes. And this is why scholars of color are important. This is why Black people, we see America in a very different way.
We've always had to for survival.
Exactly. So this Black woman sitting here saying we are on the precipice of this thing, I'm not saying it to be histrionic. No. I'm saying it experientially. I'm saying it professionally, right? And I think some of my colleagues are there, I think, which is a huge pivot from where we were a few years ago. Even with the Trump administration, even when we were being shown things, people were still like, well, we're not there yet. He was in Helsinki saying he didn't believe his entire intelligence community. He was going to take Vladimir Putin's word that he did not have anything to do with our election.
Right, right. It's so troubling. I was thinking about the debt crisis that we're facing right now. This, I think, sort of manufactured debt crisis, as far as I can tell, because we ought to pay our debts. They've been incurred, and I wouldn't put it past some people who are in positions to use their minority power and, in some degree, the majority power to 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 put us over the edge, to let everything crash, in the hopes that then we can have our saving authoritarian leader come in and win the next election with power and force and strength, because that's the kind of thing that authoritarian leaders and authoritarian followers like to have. I don't know, that's my current scary concern, is that they'll say, okay, we'll let America's economy crash, because in the end it will favor our goals, which is to move away from a democracy that truly does take into consideration the voices of all Americans. But that's
Absolutely.
my own.
No, you're absolutely right. You're a brilliant man. I mean, you see what's happening, you see what's unfolding, and that's the anti-democratic sentiment. If you are really about people first, you're not going to play around with the debt ceiling. You're not going to play around with people's lives. You're not going to play around with veterans benefits. As both of my parents being vets, right? You're not going to do those things. But here's the thing about populism. You do not need a coalition. You only need your base. So they don't care about, people saying it's going to affect, the most vulnerable populations are going to be hurt the most. Okay, Ann.
Right. It was like the people laughing at the town hall with Trump the other day, when he really dismissed the women the day after there was a finding of his liability. And there were people in the audience laughing at the idea that this was such a ridiculous notion. Like, part of me thought, well, it's just that audience. And the other part of me thought, if you are anti-democratic, you just have to have enough people who are willing to use violent force to try to take control. You don't have to convince more than 50% of the people.
Absolutely. Populism movements, have thrived with like 20% support, 25% support. So, and the thing about it is, because so much of this is rooted in racism, sexism, bigotry, people don't understand what they think they're fighting for. They think that they're fighting for a leader like Trump because they see him as someone who stands up for whiteness, right? And that's the draw. But their lives will fundamentally be worse under his regime. And it will absolutely be a regime, and there will absolutely be just a few people, within his circle, just like Vladimir Putin, to profit off the oppression in the backs of other people. Like, they're not thinking this through. This is identity bias driven, right? This is emotionally driven, and it will not benefit the same people who will sit up there and laugh, behind E. Jean Carroll being sexually assaulted, or the woman who was moderating the town hall with the former president, and him calling her a nasty woman. The same people who are sitting there laughing. You are the people. Dictators, they're following their acolytes, whatever you want to call them. They are the ones who have to carry the burden of their dear leader, right? So just like with civil rights, the same people who rejected civil rights packages, a lot of those people benefited. Right. And this is where diversity and progress is trying to drive you towards. It's not just, handouts for certain groups of people. No, all groups benefit.
Right. It's recognizing that we're all connected, we're all interconnected, but we have such a history in this country of really creating those divisions. that are contrary to people's best, that cause people to act in ways that are contrary to their true best interest,
Absolutely.
because it gives them the ability to know that they are never going to lose their whiteness or their privilege that's come from these sources. And if they were to somehow share resources and not hoard them, then somehow they think that's a threat to them. But the truth is, they're held captive by the same system. So it's
Yeah. They're not going to be oligarchs. They're not going to be part of the crew at Mar-a-Lago.
they'll be shoveling the crap outside the oligarch's house, and somebody's got to do it, and and they better like it, or else they'll get shipped off to the front lines in Ukraine. We'll see what happens. Well, you drink your tea, and I just want to say, I know what you do is truly bending the arc of history towards justice, both in your teaching and in your advising work and your actual practical work, and in presenting these facts and this world and these stories to the world on news programs and throughout. But I'm wondering, is there anything in particular that you'd like to say is truly what you think of as important for bending the arc of history towards justice, either from your own perspective or how you can encourage others to try and do that? That's always my sort of parting question to people before we let them go.
I love that question. My identity, you mentioned it earlier, my identity is my authenticity. And I sit here proudly as a Southern woman because I come from a very rich history in terms of a place where the arc of history was truly bent, right? I come from a tradition where, you know, um, rights are important, social justice is important, environmental justice is important, community is important. And so when Ukraine happened, I remember going on, I think I, my story or live on Instagram, and I said something like, I don't know why I'm in this moment, to be able to talk about this living history, something that I took and still take very seriously, but I accept the challenge. So I accept the challenge as a Southern Black woman who shows up authentic with my locks and my red lipstick, and my bold outfits and stuff like that. And I know that that makes me a target, but I feel that I want to continue that legacy of civil rights. I want to continue that legacy of social justice. And I am uniquely built for it, and not only that, it's important to me when I step into a classroom or whatever, if I'm giving a talk somewhere, I can't tell you how many young girls, their eyes light up, especially women of color when they see me. They're like, "What?" I'm like, "Yes, oh yes." And they're like, "Oh my goodness, I didn't think that, I can see myself doing what you're doing." For young Black girls who never in a million years thought about foreign policy or national security beyond maybe the military, and which I have utmost respect for. Both of my parents are vets. So in terms of bending the arc towards justice, I feel like I embody that. I feel like I am playing some small part in this unique moment in history, and I feel that my job is to inform to the best of my ability, not with opinion but with facts and details, and to represent a group of especially young women who probably felt voiceless, but they can now see themselves being on international stages and doing substantive and important work. So yeah, and I think my idea of justice is definitely wrapped up. I'm gonna say a dirty word in DEIA, but I firmly believe that diversity and true inclusion, that is true justice. Equity, that is true justice, right? And so while people are retreating away from that, I'm leaning into it because we will never have justice if we still have to fight for our basic human rights just to be in spaces. In 2023, it makes no sense that we are still talking about people being the first this, the first that. How?
Right, right.
In full inclusion, full equity, that is how we get justice.
It's past time. It's long past time, and I I love you. I thank you so much for
I love you too.
embodying all that you embody, because you really are a living testament to the possibilities of what can be done when you bring your full self authentically to your work. So thank you so much, Dr. Nola Haynes, for being my
See?
friend and for being my guest today. Have a
Yes,
wonderful
absolutely.
weekend. Happy Mother's Day to you, and thank you.
Thank you. I'll let
We'll
my
go.
mom know.
Yes, please do. And we play out all the time with the music that we've been creating for the Oakland Symphony Chorus. It's part of the Lucy Sutton suite. And have a great weekend. So long, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you for tuning in to an Archbender's Journal, The Last Will of Lucy Sutton. I've been your host, Terrence Franklin. You can find this show through YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and more. Thank you for your positive feedback, comments, questions, and for sharing this show with others.